conversation, Mark. It's great to have you on. I mean, you're a Green Party activist. You were the Green Party parliamentary candidate in 2019 for Guildford, so it's fantastic to have you on.
Yeah, thank you. It's good to be on.
So, of course, the biggest political issue I would say at the moment is the energy crisis. And is sort of energy bills as well, and of course everything going on in Ukraine at the moment, and of course Russian oil is a massive part of that. So really, I just the first part of what I wanted to ask you was actually about the energy price cap. I mean, the idea behind it is to keep energy bills down to effectively ensure that consumers aren't paying extortionate amounts, but right now they very, very clearly are. And I read your article on why we need to help people with alternative means rather than just freezing the energy price cap. So would you be able to explain a bit sort of about why you think, that there are better ways to do it than just freezing the energy price cap?
Yeah, of course. Ultimately, I think the energy cap has been in the media as much as the rising energy costs. It's been in every article about costs that households are paying. Obviously, it's referencing the rise in the energy cap, and largely, I think that's driven the sort of the policy direction of particularly the opposition parties like Labour and Liberal Democrats, and also the Greens, in targeting the price cap as something in which as a mechanism to support households. What I find quite interesting about it is, yes, it effectively works. You could freeze the cap as Labour and Lib Dems are proposing, or you could reduce the cap back to pre-October 21 level as Green Party proposing. And yes, those savings will then be directed towards the consumer. So it works. It does exactly what Labour and Lib Dems wanted to do. It does exactly what Green Party wanted to do. What's interesting is that the costs associated with such a policy, but also the knock-on effects that it would have within the market. So since sort of mid-2021, we've seen a massive increase in the market in Europe towards renewable energy sources, wind and solar in particular. That's market-driven, and that's exactly how the free market's meant to work. As it gets more expensive and prohibitively expensive, particularly, the market moves itself towards cheaper alternatives. So that's where we currently are. The Green Party has proposals on carbon taxes, for instance, that is meant to actually do this exact same thing, influence the market to move things away from carbon-intense products, particularly fossil fuels. So the idea now that we are willing to subsidize the market, effectively the market price of gas, to support households seems a bit backwards, because we're going to neutralize that market, and we're going to all of a sudden reduce the sort of urgency of the acceleration away from fossil fuels to things like solar and wind. So then it comes on to then, well, we do need to support households. Of course, we need to support households, but is there an alternative mechanism that we can look at? And when we're starting to talk about 42 billion to freeze the energy cap, that's the Lib Dem quote on the cost of it. 42 billion is a lot of money. We've got 27.8 million households in the UK, and we've got just under 5 million of them universal credit. We could afford to give every household £1,000 directly, which is what Lib Dems are saying that those households are saving per year through the price cap freeze. And we can also afford, on top of that, to give an additional £1,000 to every household on universal credit. And that will still leave us 10 billion short of what the Lib Dems are quoting their price freeze cap will be. And then the price cap only applies to households. What about businesses? So that 10 billion extra that you've got left from their policy, you can then use to target businesses. 350,000 small businesses that effectively come under the small business rates relief. We can give those support, £10,000, up to £10,000 per business, for instance. Again, there were 400,000 additional businesses brought under the COVID rates relief. We can then support those businesses in addition. So there are mechanisms where we can now support businesses as well as households, while actually ending up with a policy that's cheaper than freezing the price cap, which would then have no inadvertent effect on the market and the rate of acceleration away from fossil fuels. But am I surprised that Labour and Lib Dems didn't think about this? Not so much. But am I surprised the Greens would fall into the trap of effectively subsidising gas? Absolutely. It seems absolutely crazy direction for particularly people with an environmental focused sort of mindset to take, when we have viable alternatives of just giving the money directly to households to support them.
So do you think then it's perhaps more of a, at least for the Green Party, sort of a soundbite that, everyone knows about the energy price cap, they deal with it. It's something, not quite a physical thing, but it's very much something people understand, they know about. So do you think that maybe it was almost the idea of a policy that sounded good that almost ran away with it, even if the specifics of it weren't perhaps as good as say, directly giving people the actual financial support?
Yeah, I think there's definitely an element of that. I think that's, as I said, price cap had been so much in the press, and the increase in the price cap had been, a real focus of articles and, all over the place in media reports. There wasn't a single media report that didn't go without mention of the price cap increase. So it is one that immediately chimed with voters. It's extremely popular from a voter's perspective, completely understandably, because they can see directly the savings. And there is more complexity around arguing for just giving that money directly to households, because then you have to go down the line of, well, we're just giving people money, and then is that real justified? And it becomes more complex as something to package up and give to voters. So I'm sure that is largely the reason why we've gone down this price cap route, both the Green Party reacting to something that Labour and Lib Dems announced, but also the reason why Labour and Lib Dems went that direction in the first place.
So do you think then as well that the Lib Dem figures of how much they think it would cost and how much they also think a windfall tax could actually raise in the end, do you think that they are realistic figures, or do you think are they either over or underdone? Is there, how accurate do you think they are?
I think they're closer to the real value. I think Labour policy comes under 30 billion to do the price cap, and it also comes under, I think they've quoted something like, it's based on TUC, of something like just under 3 billion to nationalize the energy companies, which is just absurd. You're talking at least 10 times that. So I think Lib Dems have got it a little bit closer. It could be potentially, the windfall tax varies, depends on exactly how it's applied. I think you can recoup a lot of it. You won't be able to recoup all of it. I think the Green Party have mechanisms, which I think would be in distribution of wealth, which would be perfect in these sort of circumstances. We have land value tax proposals rather than a wealth tax. We potentially go down the route of land value tax instead, which I think is a lot more easy to administer as a government in terms of a tax policy. But in combination with a windfall tax, would comfortably cover this money we're talking about for support packages. So yeah, I think Lib Dems are just about there. I think in that 42 billion or so policy, as over the quote cost, I think is about right.
So sort of moving on in terms of a more long-term solution. I mean, of course, at the moment, there have been almost two competing arguments. One is investment in renewable energy and effectively going towards cleaner sources of energy and using that investment to start to bring energy prices down. And the other is, of course, North Sea oil fracking, effectively going down, or I should say back to that previous route. And of course, some of the arguments around North Sea oil and fracking are effectively that if we don't do that now, then obviously we will push people into energy poverty and all of the rest of it. And it's a much easier thing to do. And I could go on with sort of all the arguments that have been used. So how do we kind of ensure that we continue investing in that renewable energy, and sort of what are the main arguments against those? People calling for a return to those days of sort of North Sea oil and fracking?
Well, I think it's the first thing to understand before the price of oil came up, the efficacy for companies to do fracking and to extract oil in North Sea oil, it just wasn't financially viable. So the long-term financial viability of these projects is really questionable. They would require government subsidies to make them even financially viable for firms to actually take them up on in the first place, let alone all the complications with fracking that come about from local oppositions, and they'd have to run roughshod over local democracy. So it's really challenging. Fracking in particular is really, really challenging to get off the ground if the government left it well alone and let the market drive it. The government does have the option to subsidise and support directly, but my question there would be that they could support fracking, but getting fracking off the ground and with direct government subsidies, they might as well push straight into offshore wind. I mean, the sort of timescales we're talking about are very similar. So there doesn't seem to be, to me, an obvious reason why we would have to go down the route of fracking in particular. Extraction in North Sea is a little bit different, but again, the costs that we're requiring from the government, there might be a short-term gain and short-term viability financially, but once you go after 3 or 4 years, the price of gas will come back down again, then actually that viability completely falls away again. So it's much more beneficial from the long term, even the medium to long term policy for the government, if they're going to spend money and direct money towards subsidies, to direct them towards renewable energy that gives you sort of immediate short-term sort of gains. And probably the best way to do that is to pass the money on to sort of local democracies, local councils, to look at local projects and try and come up with these cooperative approaches, government-supported cooperative approaches to energy, and they can be disseminated very rapidly and amongst local communities. So I think that's largely the way to go. The market will ultimately drive it. The Conservatives aren't going to fiddle too much with the market. We know what they're all about, and the market will continue to drive towards renewables. I have no doubt about that. Providing the Conservatives, and so far they have, sort of avoid going down the route of freezing the price cap and starting to adjust and subsidise that cost of gas directly, then I think we'll see very rapidly companies, particularly large companies that have both an energy or fuel production arm as well as a utilities arm, so things that people like British Gas, I think we'll see very rapidly them backing large-scale renewable projects. So I think, generally speaking, the prospects of renewable energy looks pretty good in the short to medium term if the government leaves well alone. The talk of North Sea oil and fracking suggests to me that maybe they won't, but we'll have to wait and see.
So obviously part of it is there's this balance to meet between investing in sort of renewable energy and subsidizing it even if need be, and also supporting people now. And they're very difficult things, because on the one hand it is the here and the now problem of people who genuinely can't afford their energy bills, and on the other hand, investing in effectively the solution. It is an energy crisis, and the way to get out of it is to produce more energy. So, how do we balance those two? Because I think we found, especially as policy-wise, it's very difficult because, of course, you have those immediate problems, but you also have the solution to it. And if you don't fix that underlying problem, then the bills are going to go up to an extent where it will be, more and more difficult for the government to kind of help out.
Yeah, I think we've got to look at things. What can we do over the next 6 months, both in terms of tax and support of our households? So windfall tax makes perfect sense. All of a sudden, these firms are making, and not the utility companies. Let's bear in mind the talk of nationalising these utility companies. They're not the ones who are making loads of profit. So if you nationalise a utility company, then what you're going to end up doing is the government's going to end up paying for its cost of importing gas and energy way more than what the market can afford, which means effectively the government's going to lose money. So you will nationalise them and lose money on a monthly basis. So the utility companies aren't the problem, but the big gas and oil giants, they're obviously making a lot of money as this price has gone up. It's not in their control. It wasn't in their forecast. So a windfall tax makes perfect sense. And I don't think I've ever seen a business owner come out and almost green light a windfall tax for his own company, as we've seen recently. It's the biggest sort of yes, come and tax us I've ever seen. So that windfall tax makes perfect sense. The windfall tax is very specific. It's about the increasing cost of gas prices. So it makes sense that the entire amount of that windfall tax is then distributed back down to households to support them during this energy crisis. And what I wouldn't want to see is a windfall tax where we use part of it to subsidize or to support people now, and then part of it planned with investment. We don't need to worry about that. Let's just windfall tax them now for what their profits are now, think about that as direct support for the household, and then we can look at other tax policies to raise investment. And I don't think these sort of combined sort of private and government plan investments, things like they've done with Sizewell, are a bad thing necessarily. I think passing on that price is based on the strike price as a recouping cost, I don't think it's necessarily an issue. For instance, the strike price agreed for Hinkley right now looks really, really good for consumers. When it was only a year ago, we were worrying about it being way too high. So I don't think it's necessarily a bad way of funding it. And it does mean that we don't actually have to spend a massive amount of public money right now to get these big investments into sort of low energy solutions. So there are solutions. There are both solutions to supporting us now. There are solutions in the medium term. I think we can separate them out and fund them through various different fat taxes.
So, I mean, one of the big solutions that's being kind of put forwards at the moment with the energy crisis is, of course, been nationalisation. And I especially think on the left, it seems to be one of the big things, sort of the big solutions is, if we nationalize the main energy companies, then that will basically, solve most of the issues that we're having. And that's kind of been the message so far. So do you think that is the solution? Do you think the money could be spent, on other projects? What's kind of your view on energy nationalization?
So I'll start with on a ideological perspective. I absolutely support that public services should be public owned. There's a just a purely philosophical perspective that utilities, and also things like train companies and bus run companies, then they should not be run for profit. You take a bus service, for instance, that feeds a village that's relatively remote. That will never be something that's financially going to make any money. So that's why we see these sort of these villages become isolated because they don't have public transport. We shouldn't have to take financial decisions as part of this provision of a service. It should be expected that these services are provided. So, and it's the same with utilities companies. So it's the same with energy, and it's the same with water. We should be supplying these people have a right to these at a reasonable price that they can afford, and that's for the government to ensure. So from an ideological perspective, yes, it makes perfect sense to publicly own them. Do I support nationalizing them right now? No, is the answer. There's a time and a place to do it. In the middle of an energy crisis, is not. So Labour put the cost at 3 billion, but just to give you another idea, CPS, so Centre for Policy Studies, put the cost at 55 billion. So we have no idea what the cost of this is, but what I can tell you is it's not 3 billion. If you just look at the value of the companies, the big 5 companies that they're talking about, you can't nationalise those for 3 billion. It won't work. You nationalise them right now, then what you've got to do is you've lumped yourself into a position where you are now going to continually subsidise the cost to the consumers. So for the next 6 months, you're going to lose money. These aren't profit-making utility companies, especially if you're freezing the price cap. So you're going to then continually lose money on something that you own, and you might then make money in the future, fine. But you've just wasted probably 50 billion of the public purse on doing this right now when we can do it at a later point. So yes, nationalize the energy companies. I think that's the way to go. But right now is not the time to do it.
So actually, one thing I was interested in, so I'm in Wales at the moment, and we have a very interesting setup because, of course, England has privatised utilities, Scotland is nationalised. Of course, being the different one here, we have a non-for-profit that runs the utility companies here. So, and that has been, on and off kind of suggested as another alternative model in the mix of, either nationalising or privatising. So do you think that's something that has any merit or any possibility of working, or do you think that in the end it comes down to sort of the big 2 options?
I think it does. I think it's an interesting model. Wales is very, very interesting in how well connected it is with England. There are shared services between them. It's much more complicated to split things out in Wales compared to, say, Scotland. But I think it's a model that can work. The thing that needs to be thought about, and it's exactly the same with, say, rail, is that you can run energy providers, the suppliers for not for profit, but the national grid underneath as well has to be considered. Who owns that? Then how the future investment then works on top of that. If you nationalize everything falls under public ownership. You can take the money that is raised from the selling of the energy to both businesses and households, and use that to directly invest into other energy production. So things like in Wales, for example, the Swansea Tidal Bay Lagoon project, for instance. That could have been something that was directly funded off the back of supplying energy publicly. But because you have that disconnect between running things through a not-for-profit organization, then you don't have those monies reinvested directly into future projects. What you do have is you have bills, support for bills immediately. So the bills stay pressed low at basically cost. But then you do lose that investment point. So could energy bills be a little bit higher than they are run at cost, for instance, say 2 years ago before the price caps increased? Yes, I think they could be. I think you could squeeze them up a little bit so you can then reinvest into it. And I think that's why I'd favour in the long run nationally owned say utilities.
So the final question I have is of course on nuclear power. I mean, it's something we've spoken about actually before this even, but of course it's one of the big ones that's currently being talked about as sort of an answer to the energy crisis. And so do you think that we should invest in nuclear power now? Of course, the biggest thing is how long it will take for nuclear power to be ready. But of course, we were having these arguments 10 years ago, I suppose, at the same time. So do you think it's kind of a worthwhile investment now to put money into that?
Yeah, the Green Party was created off the back of anti-nuclear energy sort of groups back in the 70s, and they proposed every single step of the way. Sizewell B, it was something ridiculous, like 100 tons of CO2 that it saved over its lifetime, yet Green Party opposed it at the time. So we've had these arguments every single decade. Only this morning, and Caroline Lucas came out and spoke about opposing the Sizewell C nuclear power plant. The arguments on time are nonsensical. We've got an energy crisis as we currently stand. We know that we can deliver short-term solutions in terms of quick delivery, wind turbines. But for instance, one of the reactors proposed at Sizewell C is the equivalent of over 2,000 wind turbines. So Sizewell C alone is the equivalent of over 10,000 wind turbines. What I think gets missed when we talk about renewables is the scale, because nuclear energy is so energy dense. The scale of renewable projects required to even match one nuclear power plant is astronomical. So I think the answer to this is we absolutely in 10 years' time need nuclear online. For starters, it's going to just replace our current nuclear fleet, and we're not even going to increase the nuclear share for that. But it is important at the same time that we look for both government and private investment into renewable projects to fill that gap. Sorry. And the cost argument is, again, one that really gets to me. Sizewell C is going to cost something around 60 billion or something like that. 20 billion for over 60 years. So 20 billion over 60 years, 60 million homes or something, 3,200 megawatts hours of energy. The offshore wind projects at scale will cost roughly 10 billion over 30 years. So again, you replace that fleet after 30 years, it's 20 billion cost. So the cost of offshore wind, which is lauded as one of the cheapest ways of producing energy, actually works out per kilowatt hour as exactly the same as Sizewell C. So then my argument becomes, well, okay, it's a lot of money up front, and yeah, okay, you split that offshore wind, but we haven't even talked about battery storage costs. So that 30 billion is just the cost to produce energy and use it on demand. But if we're talking about 100% renewable proposal for a model for the UK, then you need battery tech included into that cost, and battery tech is not going to be cheap. So we haven't really got a cost argument against nuclear, and we haven't really got a time delivery against nuclear, bearing in mind the rollout of EVs, electrifying railway, removing gas boilers in households is only going to ever increase the energy demand. And yes, there's there's criticism about waste, but that comes from, I think, and waste is scary. Radioactive materials are scary. I work with them on a daily basis, and that perhaps neutralizes the fear factor for me individually. But there are solutions that are deployed all across the world for the management of nuclear waste, and it's proven to be safe. So the arguments really don't hold up against nuclear. And I think that's why ultimately IPCC finally came up with their report, and it included the doubling of nuclear capacity. That is the group the Green Party are pushing and using as an example, the experts in using it as an example of what we need to do, and yet conveniently miss the fact that they recommend doubling of nuclear capacity across the globe, because it is an essential component of us decarbonising our energy production.
Well, thank you so much for that very concrete answer, and thank you so much for coming on as well. And it's been fantastic to talk to you.
Oh, and you. Thank you very much.